Well, hello and welcome. I am Charles Watkinson, Associate University Librarian and Director of University of Michigan Press at University of Michigan Library in the USA. And I wanted to welcome you to OASPA Panel 1, Funding and Business Mechanisms for Equitable Open Access. It's exciting to be the first panel at this landmark conference, which brings together over 450 delegates from more than 60 countries for a global conversation at the time of great challenge and opportunity for open access. An unexpected but welcome side effect of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the development of a global movement towards greater equity, justice, and inclusion. Most of us were drawn to open access in scholarly communications because we believed that it would advance such goals. However, funding mechanisms based on author-side payments have introduced new barriers and are creating new forms of inequity. Many of us in libraries and publishing houses have been developing collective funding mechanisms that do not require author-side payments. For example, I have for the last 5 years been privileged to be part of the Lair Press initiative, supported by over 50 liberal arts college libraries in the USA, and the Knowledge Unlatched program with hundreds of supporting libraries worldwide. However, the discretionary funds that libraries have used to support these programs are now under threat from an economic downturn in higher education. In this environment, how can we move forward with funding and business mechanisms that deliver equitable open access? So luckily, we have 4 expert speakers today to help chart that path. So in this session, we will have 4 presentations. We will be waiting until the end of the session for questions and comments, but please don't hesitate to post these as they occur to you. Put your questions in the Q&A panel and use the controls to give a thumbs up to those that you like. The questions with the most thumbs up will be answered first. And I should say that the list of questions will also be posted to the Slack channel, so speakers can answer them if we run out of time. In the order that they will present, the speakers today are Vivian Berghahn, the Managing Director of Berghahn Books, Sharla Lair, the Strategist in Content and Scholarly Communication Initiatives at LYRASIS, Sam Moore, Research Fellow at the Center for Postdigital Cultures at Coventry University, and Alexia Hudson-Ward, the Azariah Smith Root Director of Libraries at Oberlin College and Conservatory, and the incoming Associate Director of Research and Learning at MIT Libraries. And you can find their bios in the program. In the order that they present, those are the speakers. And so we have time for discussion. I'll be sending them chat messages with increasingly demonstrative emojis if they are running over time. But with that, I'm going to ask Vivian, first of all, to share her presentation and take us away. Vivian, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Great. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, OASPA. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm here to talk about Subscribe to Open, and in particular, the route that we took earlier this year to launch 13 journals open access using the model. A particular note is the discipline or sort of driven approach that we took that I'll go into detail. So first, just to give you some background as to who we are, which I think gives you an understanding of the small scale and scope of what we did. We're an independent publisher in the social sciences and humanities, based in New York and in Oxford, but we also work very closely with a number of European institutes and associations. Our main fields are anthropology and European history, but we've also developed a number of subfields over the years that have been very sort of oriented to those disciplines. We publish about 125 new titles a year, 50 paperbacks, and have nearly 40 journals, of which 15 are OA, including the 13 that I'll be speaking about. And I should add that we're a family-run firm. We were founded by my mother over 25 years ago, and my eldest brother and I stepped in about 20 years ago. So what are the challenges that we currently face when it comes to OA in the HSS space? As publishers, it is of course our mission to disseminate scholarly research as a means for advancing knowledge globally. For publishers of our size, traditionally print and to some extent online have meant that there are channel constraints to our ability to reach as much of an audience as possible. So OA can certainly amplify our mission, and the mandate pressures are also now there to encourage us to do so. However, APCs don't work for us, as is sort of the topic of this whole panel, and we'll discuss further later on, and I'm really delighted to be alongside these panelists to discuss this. Publishers of our size find that there are inequalities that are rife within the APC system. They disadvantage scholars who find themselves in weaker economic circumstances, whether it be owing to their host institution, their career level, or geography. Even in the most well-funded of institutional situations, there are still vast funding discrepancies, especially outside of the STEM fields. In addition, and this was also another problem for us, that many HSS journals increasingly aren't covered by APCs. Furthermore, read and publish big deals are also not a good option for us. Not only are they geo-bound and reinforce the above-mentioned inequalities in higher education, as well as raise questions about editorial independence, they bolster the publishing monopolies that are moving us away from publishing towards a data economy. This is not a good direction for qualitative publishing to be headed. Ultimately, quantitative models of this kind are not a good fit for niche HSS fields and the liberal arts programs that support them. So we found Subscribe to Open to be a solution for funding OA without these barriers to entry. So what is Subscribe to Open? The model is a simple one, and it aims to bring about big transformation for journals by changing as little as possible. In short, it mimics the current normal subscription process. Libraries allocate funding by continuing to subscribe. They use the same channels as before, and they receive the same journals as before. So these are channels, for instance, using subscription agents and other sorts of means that help and allow for the process to go much smoother and reduce some of the admin burdens that a lot of the OA negotiations have really made challenging, especially for publishers of our size. So who would support such a model? I would offer up researchers and librarians. So why would libraries support this model? They are, after all, key curators in supporting collections. And they're now on the front line in tackling OA. OA is a huge admin burden for all involved. It offers a much smoother participation process to use the systems that are already in place and on the whole working well. It removes the article level admin nightmares that we all encounter otherwise. Above all libraries can participate. The same well-resourced libraries that are able to participate and read and publish can also participate, and they've actually been key supporters for this model. But those big deals don't work for every library, whether it be for resources and size, and they can participate at whatever level they feel comfortable participating in, whether that's the same single title they may have subscribed to before, or whether it's a collection. And why researchers? As authors and readers, they are key stakeholders in journal selections outside of the world of the big deals. They want their journals to survive, and they want to continue to publish in them. Just as engaged advocates are vital for the subscription journal, the same holds for Subscribe to Open. And the research community is increasingly informed and mobilized when it comes to OA, and they know better than any of us when it's not working for them or their discipline. And it's the discipline-driven approach that our pilot took that was a real mobilizing force for us. Caring for fields you serve matters, and there's a lot of goodwill to support publishers in recognition of that. This is why this was a good model for us and for publishers of our type, because the publishing you do remains far more relational than the scaled quantitative operations of the big players. In our case, the researcher collective Libraria came along just as the momentum for OA was taking hold in anthropology. As researchers who are also former and current journal editors, the Libraria team approaches OA transitions with appreciation for the journals that currently serve their fields well. But they're certainly not uncritical to the direction publishing has taken, and so they seek to remedy it. Libraria was instrumental throughout this entire process. So this is a timeline of how it took us to get to open access for our 13 journals. While the Subscribe to Open model originated with annual reviews, our own path started in 2017, following a meeting with Libraria that was initiated by one of our journal editors. As you can see from the timeline, this was a process of careful consideration of the many pros and cons of going OA, and it involved many stakeholders along the way. The defining moment for us was an MIT workshop last spring. During that MIT workshop, journal editors, librarians, publishers of all sizes, the smallest to the biggest, and funders, international funders, US funders, European funders, all came together to discuss the state of OA and how to flip journals, and how our pilot might fit into that landscape. It was a packed day, including breakout groups, and then we all came together again as a larger group, and then we discussed the sentiments that had come out during some of the smaller breakout sessions. The pilot then in its very early stages was on the hot seat, and it was a tough crowd. But all were ultimately supportive and sort of wished us luck, and so we left with sort of renewed enthusiasm for really undertaking this initiative. From then on, the shortest amount possible was spent trying to put the pilot into implementation, and this is definitely not something I would recommend. It was definitely a sort of quite fraught fall of 2019, but we felt we had so much goodwill and the momentum was there, and we really felt the time was right. So for our pilot, we selected 13 of our core anthropology titles for the model. Depending on how many journals you have, for instance, you don't have to go in all at once. Different models may work for different journals, even in the same publishing program. You can find full details on our site, including a range of FAQs that we created not only for authors, but also for librarians. And you can also see the participants as well as sort of a detailed history. As you can see, participating was rather simple. We really took what we did to try and really make it as easy as possible for the current libraries to really just continue to subscribe as they did, or some of the more sort of core libraries that we have in the disciplines opted to upgrade to the entire collection. So the beauty of this model is that any library could continue at a single title level, using the same pricing parameters as before. And so we just tried to, as I said, keep it simple. By January, we felt we were in a good enough position to launch open access in 2020. So then, of course, there is the question of the sustainability of the model. How do we address economic recession and the vulnerabilities that we're all facing in a post-COVID world? I think ultimately this model remains a value proposition, just as with its subscription variant predecessor. It's tied to library budget trends. There's no way around that. So it won't prevent attrition through collections reductions or budget cuts. But no journal is immune from that. However, it will prevent attrition from libraries who are no longer willing to support traditional paywall models. And those numbers are growing, especially in light of COVID and the remote learning environments that we all face. Our goal is to find, perhaps in a later phase of this model, a way to bring funder resources in for whatever funds there are. I think it's a shame not to be able to use them. And however, as came out at the MIT workshop from the funders who attended, there are currently legal and structural barriers for many of them. So it's really also on them to reconsider how they choose to support open access and possibly change some of their current methods. But ultimately, doing nothing is not an option. The traditional subscription model is increasingly compromised. Publishers shouldn't take their big deals for granted. and mandates may shift, but they're ultimately staying put. And the value of publishing OA is ever greater. COVID-19 has certainly accelerated that. So should this model be right for you, then please connect with the community of practice for Subscribe to Open that has recently formed. It's a collective of like-minded stakeholders, including publishers, librarians, funders, and intermediaries. It's spearheaded by annual reviews, and our objective is to publicize best practices and share experiences, all with the goal of normalizing Subscribe to Open as a robust and sustainable path to open access. As you can see, more and more publishers are finding the merits of this model. And so in closing, I wanted to reiterate why I think this is the prime time for community-driven publishers to take a leading role in the OA transitions that are abound. It's time for OA to be reclaimed by its disciplines so that the ultimate forms of OA publication fit the field. The APC models do not do that, at least in the humanities and social sciences. We feel that in our role as scholarly publishers, we should do what we can to work ever closer with our research communities and the librarians and funders that support them. Subscribe to Open is an equitable model. It's rooted in the best of what traditional, qualitative, community-supported journal publishing has to offer. And I would argue the same holds for books. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivian. And I'm already starting to see some great questions in the Q&A section. Please do use the Q&A section to ask other questions, which we'll come to at the end. And I'm going to pass over immediately to Sharla Lair to give our second presentation.
So hello all, I am very honored to sit among such tremendous panelists and have an opportunity to talk to you all today about something that I am passionate about. So I thank you for your consideration and your time. Most mechanisms to support funding of open access are inequitable. This is because many of the existing business and funding mechanisms that are implemented to sustain open access publishing often replicate the same systems built mostly by commercial entities, whereby it assumes only a small and better resource subset is interested or able to invest. Because of this assumption, marketing, education, and outreach about open access excludes a significant portion of the community that has been supporting scholarly publication all of this time. For example, many of the current models and infrastructures that support open access funding assume that only large, well-resourced research institutions want or are able to participate. Funding models built on this assumption leave out most teaching and learning institutions who have been participating in acquiring much of the same scholarly content under paywalled models for decades. Although they do not typically have strong research output, these institutions still have a vested interest in providing access to scholarly content to support their missions for teaching and learning. And nothing has changed in an OA world. In fact, they value the content enough to continue the status quo of acquiring it through a legacy subscription and purchase models, often because very few have offered an open alternative that they may participate in. In my time performing outreach to libraries in the US about Scope 3, I was amazed at how many institutions I encountered that still do not have a strong grasp on what open access even is. This is because no one ever engaged in a conversation with them about open before. This dearth of awareness is quite evident when you engage with a community-oriented open access program like Scope 3 because it engages multiple stakeholders. These inequities do not just exclude teaching and learning institutions. Other stakeholders in our community, such as higher education funding bodies like provost and research offices, disciplinary departments, as well as public libraries and museums who are positioned to serve the commons and general public, are rarely considered as collaborators to sustain open access programs. By building models and funding mechanisms that exclude other agencies, institutions, or organizations from collaboratively funding open scholarly content, then the financial burden falls on a very small subset of organizations with now shrinking budgets to support the entire transition to open access. The continuation of the status quo systematizes acting in solitude, forcing those who do invest or fund open access to focus on the local needs over the global needs due to smaller budgets, competing dollars, and little opportunities to make their dollars go further. Focusing on one individual entity or subset at a time causes silos of action. This is the opposite direction from the coordinated action necessary to transition and sustain open scholarly publishing. This solitary form of action leads to a lack of diversity in content, publishers, authors, readers, learners, and ultimately society. Open access is not sustainable in such a world. We are better together by acting together and collaboratively investing funds. Those we serve will have access to more diverse content than they would by us acting alone. But it is not enough to tell everyone, let's work together. This kind of coordination requires collective agency through and through. If you want collective agency to be successful, you must facilitate collective agency. If you want your funding models to be equitable and inclusive, you have to embed equity and inclusiveness in every part of the business model and mechanism utilized to capture funding. Whatever outcome you are looking for, equity, diversity, inclusion, transparency, collaboration, it must be embedded within the entire culture and infrastructure that you use to support that outcome for it to be authentic and sustainable. We need a radical new form of cooperation that facilitates the community we want to be. So what could this radical form of cooperation look like? It can be a trusted place that facilitates community building around investment in open access content. This place equitably connects multiple stakeholders in the scholarly publishing landscape, including funders, institutions, libraries, authors, and editors. It facilitates an experimental and incubation space for emerging open access funding and business models. It centralizes the administration and funding of open access initiatives or programs at multiple scales and makes transparent to the community at large who is participating in each investment community. This place also provides a funding hub for more bespoke programs, output from smaller publishers, and niche scholarly output in order to maintain diversity of scholarship. It also enables investors to strategically fund either individual programs or distribute funds across multiple programs that align with their missions, all in one place, increasing efficiencies and convenience. And finally, it encourages mission matching between the investor and the program in order to build and maintain trust and integrity. In recent years, places like these have been developed outside of scholarly publishing. Crowdfunding sites such as GoFundMe, Charity Matchmaker, valuation sites like Charity Navigator or Great Nonprofits, and socially responsible mutual fund or impact investment firms have made huge strides in providing infrastructure to support matchmaking between funders and programs, all the while providing a vetting service so that investors can evaluate programs by whatever criteria best serves their missions. Within the scholarly publishing sphere, other collective action programs have emerged. The Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services, or SCOSS, is a network of organizations that assist selected non-commercial open science service organizations in meeting fundraising targets. Invest in Open Infrastructure, or IOI, formed as a coalition of projects and organizations developing a framework for open scholarly infrastructure, including criteria, advocacy, collaboration, and resources, with plans for development of a funding pool. Community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs, or COPM, is an international partnership of researchers, universities, librarians, open access book publishers, and infrastructure providers. It is building community-owned open systems and infrastructures to enable open access book publishing. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the recent UKSG Insights article, Open Access Exchange, an economic model and platform for fundraising open scholarship services, where the authors outlined a thought concept around what a crowdfunding resource for open content could look like in the real world. These programs and concepts exemplify what our global community needs to sustain open scholarship and are the inspiration for a new program being developed by LYRASIS in partnership with a cadre of organizations who are passionate about baking in our community's values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, transparency, integrity, and mission alignment. This new program is a community-driven, scalable crowdfunding and management program for community-vetted open access content initiatives. For lack of a better name, we are currently calling this the LYRASIS Open Access Community Investment Program. We are still in very early stages and have yet to finalize naming it. My hope is that as the community continues to build it, a proper name will emerge. Names aside, very soon, LYRASIS and our partner, Transitioning Society Publications to Open Access, or TSPOA, hope to officially announce a pilot to test the viability, scalability, and sustainability of the proposed program very soon. We are beginning this pilot with a society journal published by a U.S. university press and will explore a community-vetted crowdfunding approach for them by having the press answer various criteria questions on behalf of the participating journal. The answers to these criteria will be the basis for investment decisions by investors, namely libraries, but also any other organizations who wish to participate. These criteria will provide transparency around issues important to investors in this space, such as publishing history and mission, investment goals and how funds will be used, disciplinary or scholarly impact, description of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the publication or publisher, and compliance with technical standards such as preservation, interoperability, accessibility, and metadata. Why is this important? In 2018, an IMLS National Forum grant led by James Madison University explored perspectives and opportunities for collective action to support open access. The report, OA in the Open, Community Needs and Perspectives, notes, the open content landscape is massive and unwieldy. Librarians at large university, even those with dedicated scholarly communication librarians, were as likely to cite being overwhelmed and underinformed as were those from smaller staffed institutions. One of the conclusions from OA in the Open is the strong desire for the development of clear criteria and perhaps even a centralized clearinghouse or catalog of vetted projects, products, and platforms that could be used to aid decision-making and to speed the approval process. Now you might be asking, why LYRASIS? Well, consortia like LYRASIS are well positioned to support this type of collective action, providing infrastructure for community vetting as well as the ability to manage financial transactions between libraries and publishers. LYRASIS already has experience serving as a national agent for open content programs such as Scope 3, Knowledge Unlatched, and Open Library of Humanities. By applying community-vetted crowdfunding strategies, LYRASIS can centralize administration and funding of more open content initiatives at a regional or national level. If this pilot proves its concept and the program is formalized, it has the potential to result in a web-based service to support information transfer, promote a diverse array of open access programs seeking investment, manage secure transactions, and provide return on investment reports to users. It will also be interoperable so that other consortia or groups around the world can manage their own instance at their local level, but connect to a global community investment portal for programs that exceed political boundaries. By design, it will engage all stakeholders in the research and scholarly communication ecosystem in order to initiate and sustainably maintain the participating OA programs. So to close, despite the tidal waves of uncertainty and injustice, confusion and worry we all face these days, we can connect, work to empower those we serve, make daily efforts to cultivate generosity, and still create space to find the good stuff. I found some of that good stuff in a recent OASPA webinar when Kathleen Fitzpatrick said, "We must reimagine the ways that our institutions and organizations facilitate scholarly communication. We must shift in understanding the goals of open access from making individual publications openly available to focusing instead on opening the infrastructure that supports our ability to make those publications, their data, and their ensuing conversations available. We must approach the future collectively and collaboratively. We share the problems we face, and so all must similarly share in the solutions. Even when we are most isolated, we remain most interdependent, and the more we rely on our tools for interconnection, the more control we need over the ways they work. We have to acknowledge that building and sustaining shared, interoperable, academy-owned and governed infrastructure to support scholarly communication is not only of the highest priority, but is going to require radical new forms of cooperation across institutional lines." These words are so inspiring, and they give me courage and hope that together we can learn to see that the choices we make as a community are not just expressions of control, but also as affirmation of our collective missions, values, and goals. We must collaboratively reimagine how we work together, fail and learn together, and invest in each other so that we can successfully navigate the tensions often found when we juxtapose values of transparency, integrity, accountability, and mission alignment. We will not have the power to change the rules that control scholarly communication unless we build the power and trust within and across our communities to reimagine the very stubborn mental model that governs how people think scholarly communication works. I hope to rally those who are ready to challenge the status quo and replace it with a reality that is vastly more conducive to our deep-seated human need to contribute to something bigger than ourselves. If we believe in a world in which all scholarship is equitably available to all who wish to access it, and if we believe that the current stakeholders, the likes of libraries, higher education administration, scholars, publishers, funders, if they're the ones who can deliver on that vision, then it is our collective responsibility to equitably connect, educate, and empower those who are committed to leading in a way that will more likely bring that vision to life. We must acknowledge the flaws in our current systems and admit that our current system isn't right, or even best. It is just the system that we are used to, one preferred and advanced by a minority, not the majority. If this is indeed the case, then we have an opportunity to advance a different reality, one that requires a more effective connection infrastructure that facilitates sustainable funding of open access content by leveling the playing field so that multiple stakeholders can equitably participate in our shared scholarly communication community. Thank you.
Sharla, thank you very much indeed. Next up, we have Sam Moore. So Sam, if you'd like to get your slides loaded, we're having some great questions and answers coming in over the Q&A feature. Please keep them coming, and we look forward to addressing them at the end. Okay, Sam, we see your screen. It looks great. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. So thanks for inviting me to speak today. Thanks to OASPA and everyone for arranging this conference under kind of unusual circumstances. And thanks to Charles and my fellow panelists for bringing this together. So the title of this talk is Scaling Small, New Forms of Collectivity for Resilient Open Access. So I'm an open access theorist and practitioner, I guess. I'm interested in kind of new ways of publishing by sort of bringing scholars together in order to build what I kind of think of and what my colleagues think of as sort of mutual reliance. And so this talk is going to interrogate, I guess, some of the assumptions around business model sustainability and scale with reference to a couple of projects that I'm involved with, and drawing on an article that myself and my friend and co-author Yannick Adam are currently writing, and which should be published in, I don't know, hopefully the next kind of few months or so. So just firstly about me, just kind of probably relevant that I had a 10-year career in publishing, so I kind of understand it from a sort of practical standpoint in open access publishing, I guess, working primarily in editorial for PLOS, and for open book publishers, Ubiquity Press. I'm now an information studies academic at Coventry University in the Center for Postdigital Cultures, where I'm a research fellow. And so my research focus is on kind of the ethics and politics of scholarly communication, trying to kind of critique the implementation of open access, largely by commercial publishers and how it's being rolled out. And then from, again, a more practical side, thinking about building scholar-led alternatives, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, to somewhat regressive forms of open access. I'm also the co-organizer of the Radical Open Access Collective, which is, I'll talk about today, I guess. And also I'm a postdoc researcher on the community-led open publishing infrastructures for monographs, the COPEM project, which I will talk about today. So this presentation, I guess, will focus on two assumptions around business models for open access. It's often said that the business models should be both sustainable and that they should scale. But I guess what do we mean by these two concepts? What are the limitations of scale and sustainability as frames for the future of open access publishing? So again, I'll be exploring these questions with respect to these two projects here. That's the Radical Open Access Collective and the Coping Project, the two logos you see. So there's an assumption embedded within scholarly publishing, particularly in Europe and North America, that publishing projects must be sustainable, that they must kind of pay their way through a recognizable set of processes and structures for recovering costs. So that's often based on payments at the supply side in the form of APCs and BPCs that both Sharla and Vivian mentioned, or the demand side through subscriptions and other forms of charges, purchasing agreements. So this assumption, I'm arguing, carries with it kind of the weight of marketization, the idea that the private sector kind of has to be responsible for the provision of the scholarly literature as part of a somewhat kind of competitive market. So the moment we introduce sustainability, we introduce this idea of the market. And I guess there are other ways of thinking about that. So sustainability itself brings with it a host of problems. So it enforces market principles onto scholarly publishing. That may be good, that may be bad, but that's what I'm arguing is the assumption for much of the open access discourse, is that it has been marketized in the same way that higher education has been marketized and basically everything else has since the 80s. And so this results in sort of inflexible profit-seeking models for publishing, such as those APCs again, transformative agreements, and then increasing, I think Sharla mentioned it, the increasing extraction of user data and monetizing our kind of transactional data for profit. This is particularly pernicious for my fields, for monograph-based, book-based disciplines, underrepresented and marginalized scholarships. And this also discourages forms of publishing that may not receive a market return. So sort of the more esoteric scholarships or just stuff that basically the market doesn't value. And also it's worth bearing in mind that monograph publishing kind of has always been subsidized. It's never been kind of sustainable. It's been subsidized through university presses and such. It's only relatively recently, many people talk about this, that it has been a kind of purely market-centric activity. And so open access therefore kind of offers a chance to reassess this sustainability is the sort of the argument I'm making. So one way in which my colleagues and I are exploring new approaches to this sustainability is through various publishing collectives. So for example, the Radical Open Access Collective, which was formed in 2016, and I'm kind of one of the co-organizers of. It's formed to bring together the kind of increasing number of scholar-led publishers that have that sort of cropped up in the past 10 years, 20 years, etc. These are some of the members here on the screen. It's global in terms of representation, linguistically diverse. It's kind of humanities and social sciences, book publishers, experimental publishers, kind of lots of different kinds of things. They're all very small, scholar-led. That's pretty much the only criteria, is that you have to be kind of identify as a scholar, however that is really. So the Radical Open Access Collective is responding to this push for sustainability through what we're trying to do is build mutual reliance and cooperation between the members. That's sort of the main idea behind. It's about bringing kind of members together. It's kind of quite democratic, it's completely horizontal. We don't have any leadership, so it's very informal as well. So we share resources on our website and kind of advice through the mailing list, and then promote one another's work at events and online, etc. So again, it's about seeing one another as collaborators rather than competitors. And so the Radical Open Access Collective, it seeks to sort of show scholar-led publishing as a distinct kind of model for an alternative version of scholar-led publishing. And so we're foregrounding things like experimentation and care for relationalities, and underrepresented cultures of knowledge. Those are the sort of guiding principles, I guess. So, so formalized sustainability is not really the correct frame for what we're trying to do here with the Radical Open Access Collective. Although I guess resilience and sort of informal kind of network building might be a better frame for it. Very few of the presses who are part of the collective have sustainable business models in the traditional sense, or really any model at all. They often mix models, they just get things done, or they redirect their labor from their kind of traditional commercial publishing commitments to their own labors of love. And so through kind of caring for one another, we're trying to show that scholar-led publishing can be a workable model for a particular kind of open access. Is that all I wanted to say on that? Yeah, I think it is. And so the second question that I wanted to address is does it scale? That's another kind of common question which is presented when you're sort of introducing a new open access project. And so by scale, I mean the kind of economic advantages to expansion through efficient production processes and technological processes. It literally means kind of expanding without changing. Can you expand your business without having to change it, I guess? So the idea here is that in order to truly kind of impact the world of publishing, new entrants must be designed to scale like a platform from the beginning, rather than sort of small and grow, etc. As this kind of quote from Richard Fisher attests, where he says, at present, we have numerous very welcome small-scale open access publisher experiments, but these remain artisanal, cottage-sized responses to what is a global challenge of academic production on a massive industrial scale. I mean, even if they're not looking to change the world, there's still a kind of sense that we have to, and it's sort of, so we're just trying to think about it in a slightly different way. And so again, there are problems with this discourse on scalability. So scale publishing operations, they sort of have this homogenizing tendency. They homogenize production processes, turning them into cookie cutters. So stuff kind of is all funneled through the same passages, and they start to look the same. These passages are the ones designed kind of by publishers in the global north, and so public kind of scale sort of has works against difference in that regard, or experimentation. Scale also favors kind of consolidation and the big players, monopolization, a kind of winner takes all approach, because you're essentially sort of fighting to be the biggest publisher, I guess, or the one in a particular area that sort of scales the best. But also it's worth bearing in mind that scale in publishing works not just because of technological efficiency, but because of the unremunerated labor provided by academics. They wouldn't be able to scale without academics kind of providing so much of the labor for free. So yeah, academic editors and reviewers, they take on more of this labor because it's largely unpaid, and so publishers kind of are allowed to, they can expand more easily because they don't have to pay everyone, basically, is one of the arguments. And so one way we're trying to explore this tension between scale and, I guess, locality is through the Coping project, which Sharla mentioned, the community-led open publishing infrastructures for monographs project, which is a lovely acronym. So we're a 3-year multi-institutional initiative funded by UKRI and the Arcadia Fund in order to design infrastructures and workflows for scholar-led monograph publishing. So it seeks to preserve the diversity of scholar-led publishing projects while allowing them to benefit from a shared ecosystem of kind of technical and financial resources and other kinds of resources, all managed by a range of actors in scholarly communication. So on the screen are a bunch of the actors who are involved in the project, but then it will be extending outwards to library network, to other publishers, and we'll be kind of inviting people kind of into the project is sort of the intention. So I'm aware that I don't really have too much time to go into the project, but I thought I'll just briefly describe it. So yeah, we're going to develop these enriched, not-for-profit open source ecosystem for open access book publishing. And that's going to include designing with scholar-led publishing in mind, new forms of archiving and dissemination, funding, and then like the governance rules, which is what I'm particularly involved with, for managing the infrastructure, and then reuse of published material as well. And it aims to stimulate collaborations with presses, libraries, universities, and other actors involved in communication. So again, we're continually trying to sort of nurture these ideas of collaboration and bringing people in and making kind of an ecosystem of collaborators, all sort of looking out for one another. I mean, there will be conflict. That's what we're going to be working out, how to deal with conflict. But it's just about viewing people in a slightly different way, I guess, viewing people as partners rather than as sort of antagonistic towards one another. And so, yeah, so this will be based on nurturing a different kind of scale then through collaboration and mutual reliance, or what we're calling scaling small. So I'll just to finish. So scaling small is about creating the infrastructures that allow all of these small presses to thrive at multiple scales. So it doesn't presuppose that you'll have a bunch of presses competing with one another, or one large organization imposing its standards on others. And so it just thinks about scale in a different way. So in doing this, we take advantage of scale and kind of global presence, I guess, without a loss of the local diverse cultures of knowledge. So I think I just wanted to end on this Anna Singh quote. It's quite long, but it really kind of captures what we're sort of trying to get at with arguments around scalability. So she writes that projects that could expand through scalability are the poster child of modernization and development. Agribusiness expanded, biological populations expanded, scalable approaches to knowledge expanded. We learn to know the modern by its ability to scale up. Scalable expansion reduced a once surrounding ocean of diversity into a few remaining puddles. Project advocates thought they had grasped the world, but they have been confronted with two problems. First, expandability has gotten out of control. Second, scalability has left ruin in its wake. Non-scalable effects that once could be swept under the rug have come to haunt us all. So we just want to take care, I guess, of these non-scalable elements in open access publishing in opposition to the tendency in open access for economies of scale that homogenize locality and sort of flatten difference. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And as Alexia brings up her slides, I will just say, Sam, that there's a lot of questions going on about your claim that the minute we introduce sustainability, we introduce the market, it forces market principles. So something we'll definitely want to come back to, the question of what sustainability means in the Q&A. So be thinking about that. And Alexia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I want to thank everyone, all of the colleagues who are joining us internationally today for this really important conversation. I've been enjoying my co-panelists. I hope that you all have been as well. I also want to acknowledge the bigness and the challenges of the times that we're in. And so I hope that you are giving yourselves a virtual pat on the back, or a fist bump, or a hug, or whatever appropriate gesture there is for your specific culture, because it's a big deal to come to an international conference in the middle of a global pandemic on Zoom to talk about open access. And so while this is a passion point for us, you know, I also just want to share with you that I see you and understand exactly how you are feeling. And so I'm going to talk briefly about what I consider to be the democratizing value of open access. And so I often have to start with disclaimers, particularly because so much of our dialogue is litigated in what we refer to in the United States as the court of public opinion. And so while I have one foot in one job or gig, as we refer to it in the US, and a foot in another position. I just want everyone to be clear that I'm really going to be talking a lot about my personal commitment to open access initiatives and my specific work with Lever Press. And so I'm hoping that, you know, individuals won't take my opinions as the official opinion of Oberlin College and Conservatory or MIT. I literally will be starting at MIT on October 1st. So I feel like I should be there before I give an official opinion on behalf of the libraries after my boss greenlights it. And so many of you all have heard in the United States, we have lost a giant, someone who really lobbied for women's rights and for equality. 87 years old, Supreme Court Justice. I was having a conversation with a colleague in London yesterday, you know, who was saying that they really didn't understand how significant this individual was to us in the United States. Yet she always had such amazing quotes. And I felt like this particular quote was vital and important to leverage our discussion and ongoing dialogue around the importance in terms of democratizing open access, is that we should fight for the things that we care about, but we should do it in a way that will lead others to join us. And so, you know, what's also taking place, you know, in these times, you know, it's so much that's happening as it relates to open access. And so I just want to give you some top lines in terms of how my professional principles intersect with open access. And so I fundamentally believe that libraries democratize learning, and that open access is an essential diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiative for both the information and the cultural heritage professions, and that the humanities and humanists really should be contributing to what we often refer to in North America as the so-called greater good by sharing insights and research with the general public. We've been using the phrase a lot in America called the public humanities, but to me that is really one of the most vital suppositions as it relates to open access. Because it's compelling to me how we have made open closed, how we have made a global movement that elevates and celebrates this notion and this concept of opening up scholarship. We have made it exceptionally exclusive. And there are many ways that this exclusivity plays itself out across multiple countries and across multiple disciplines. But to me, this is the heart of the challenge that we face as a community that is committed to this work and that is committed to this supposition. As many of you all have seen or perhaps have participated in, the American Black Lives Matters movement has become a global movement, and there are micro movements that are coming from this global movement. Black scholarship matters, Black cultural arts matters, Black heritage matters, Black art matters, right? And we are now going to be confronted with the notion of a generation of scholars who are coming up and are not going to accept our traditional kind of Greco-Roman suppositions as it relates to scholarship and the ways in which the academy privileges certain scholarship over other scholarship. And so in the context of what I've been working on as it relates to advancing an equitable open access business model, is that the Oberlin College Libraries, of which I am the director for the next several days, partnered with 5 other institutions within Ohio, where we started doing a lot of work funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that was faculty-led open access and digital initiatives projects. And those projects continue to grow, that work continues to grow. It's really exciting now that they're really thinking about this in more of a laboratory model. So taking the STEM and STEAM approaches and really collating that into this notion of open access and digital humanities, which is really exciting. Yet my most significant work has entailed on serving, along with Charles, on the Lever Press Oversight Committee for the past 3 years. And so I want to talk a little bit around inequities and sustainabilities. And so what are the inequities that I see existing within our community. And so particularly in North America and perhaps in other countries as well, the professional discourse around open access appears to be dominated primarily by white males and large university presses effectively pushing out and marginalizing smaller presses, people of color, women, and possibly members of the LGBTQ community. The open access community also appears to privilege traditional presentations and expressions of peer-reviewed research. And so therefore documenting active movements like the environmental climate movement, which is also a global movement, and Black Lives Matter, it really seems reliant on a very loosely connected international archiving network that does not at this point appears to be supported from or has any intersections, quite frankly, with the open access global. And so what I was saying, everyone, to capture that point that was lost in the internet connection is that the documenting of other active movements, such as Black Lives Matter and the climate movements, really does appear to be reliant on a loosely connected international archiving network that doesn't appear to be supported by or has much intersection with the global open access community. And so there are aspects of inequality that Lever Press is attempting to address. Among those is that scholars at smaller institutions are afforded the ability to work with a press that's really committed to balancing coaching scholars through the publication process, but there's also a double peer review process that's quite rigorous, and that the content that can be presented through Lever Press can be multimedia. And so Lever just released a book that shows multimedia content, which is really fabulous, a book on jazz. And so it really does expand how scholars can creatively present their work. And so what is the outlook for sustainability? And so there are a couple pieces I'll run through really quickly in my last few minutes, is that Lever and other small independent presses really now seem to have their footing, and they have published an impressive set of titles that, at least with Lever, they are managed by an editorial board, an oversight committee, and also supported by the University of Michigan Library. So there's a lot of strength and power within those connections. That Lever's membership is currently limited to liberal arts colleges, and so yet there is some discussion around how the criteria for participation in Lever needs to be reshaped potentially to include larger universities. That there are several US-based foundations that have turned their funding priorities towards social justice initiatives, and OA really does have the potential to fit in that. And that without a doubt, everyone, COVID-19 really is a burden and an opportunity for Lever Press and for all of us, because the fallout from a financial perspective makes OA intriguing and necessary for many institutions of higher education, but it's also going to be difficult for others to financially sustain. And so funding mechanisms must determine what specific initiatives that they would like to focus on that are diversity related, so that it can create a financial plan that measures progress against those goals annually. It's important that presses and boards and oversight committees are compositionally diverse, and that they really look at that as a means of cultivating and also catalyzing these diverse perspectives and these information networks to grow also the next generation of OA leadership. And the other part is that it's important that our efforts really be scaled to ensure platform neutrality. Many places in the world, the on-ramp onto the internet is through mobile devices, and yet many of our OA publishing platforms still privilege laptops and desktop computers, at least in North America. And so I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to raise these important issues, and I'll turn it back over to Charles.
Alexia, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all the presenters for their case studies and comments. So now we're going to go into a question and answer session. And just a reminder, please do use the Q&A functionality. at the bottom of the screen. And thanks to some of our panelists who have been answering as we go, some specific questions for them. But I want to dive into a really big question that's come up, and Lisa Hinchliffe asked this at the start, and Alexia also referred to this a bit. Equity is defined in many different ways. I'd be interested in hearing the speakers reflecting on how they define equitable open access and if they're using the same definitions. Alexia, you brought this up a lot. Could you reflect on this a bit?
Yes, and thank you, Lisa, for that great question. It's a really important one. Equity is what we refer to in the United States as falling under a broad tent. And so I think that it's really vital that we make sure that we create statements and then subsequently business models around what form of equity works for us. So for me, equity is really about platform neutrality, and it privileges all forms of scholarship. And so that scholarship could be dance, that scholarship could be art, that scholarship could be music, it could be the broad range of the sciences, the humanities, etc., but in a way that invites those who are not, quote unquote, a part of the academy to be able to read, enjoy, and marshal out on those insights.
And I'm going to turn to the other speakers in a moment, but there's a follow-up there, which is about your comment around OA tending to privilege traditional research. Can you speak about that a bit more? And how do you see it tied to other issues in the space, such as markers of prestige and tenure? And what are some of your thoughts about how to address that traditional research issue?
Yeah, that's a really tough one because the structure around promotion and tenure internationally privileges a very specific type of scholarship. And I feel, quite frankly, if I were to put a timestamp on it, everyone, it's probably going to take us another decade to kind of disentangle some of those privileged suppositions. You know, prior to coming to Oberlin College, I went through promotion and tenure at Penn State. And that was one of our ongoing battles. Back then, it was all around virtual reality and how people thought that was a kooky idea. And then consequently, how that could fit within a dossier in order to be promoted and tenured. So this is a difficult question. I won't necessarily say that I have the answer to it, but I do think that if we're going to perpetuate the academy by bringing in younger scholars, that those individuals are going to constantly push and challenge us around some of our traditional notions of what is equitable, what is scholarship, what is relevant, what is not, if it should be peer reviewed, does peer review matter? So I have to say, I really don't have a great answer for it, but I think that we're at a precipice that's going to go on for the next 10 years on this important topic.
So equitable open access, other participants in the panel, what does it mean to you? What are the aspects of equitable open access? Sam, any thoughts here? And then Sharla?
Yeah. So I guess one of the guiding principles of the Radical Open Access Collective is care, ethics of care. I think so. I kind of tend to sort of foreground that as a concern which I'm interested in, and so many of the different presses involved will talk about care. It could be care of the relational aspects of publishing, the labor, the supply chains, the finished book, or it could be even Foucault's notion of care of the self, which is a guiding principle for punctum books. Mattering presses sort of guided by sort of more STS notions of care, which sort of differ from kind of the calculation of the market and the choice within the market, and so that kind of unsettles I guess non-care based approaches to publishing, and in a sort of, so that's kind of how I think about equitability would be sort of caring for people, and what that means is to sort of meet them where they are, rather than enforcing, like Alexia says, rather than enforcing particular understandings of scholarship on them or publishing on them, all those kinds of things. It's a sort of a community-led process, I guess.
And Sharla, equitable open access.
Yeah, I echo what Sam said in the sense of the meeting people where they are. There's equality and then there's equity. And with equality, the idea is that you're giving everybody an equal chance, the same chance, right? That you're being fair in what you're providing them. But equity is that you're meeting them where they are. So if they need a little more than the person next to them, that you provide that for them. And so how that translates within open access, I mean, you can see that with the scholars, right? There are some scholars that can go more in the traditional track, and that they find those publishers that meet their needs. But there are some that have such niche interests, and where do they go for that? And that diversity of knowledge, that nicheness is not any less valuable just because it's not the same as what everybody else does. It needs to be captured and expressed and accessible as well. But that also goes on the other side of how it is funded, like I had been talking before. It's the entire community, the entire workflow and process where equity needs to be embedded, and meeting every stakeholder where they are is where I am envisioning open access to go. It's not just about the reader, it's not just about the publisher, but it's about everybody in between.
And Sarah Ruhi online on Twitter has provided a nice definition here. Equity is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Tackling equity issues requires an understanding of the root causes. And thanks you, Sharla, for the distinction between equity and equality. Vivian, any thoughts here on equity?
Sure. I mean, I think just to echo, obviously, the sentiments that have been raised, but I think for us, it's also sort of about giving voice to silenced readers and authors, subjects as a publisher, very niche topics. Of course, I would support the sentiment that they're equally as important, even if very specialized. And I think, it really is about making sure that these sort of pay-to-play models, which generally, really do favor certain areas, certain career levels especially as well. I mean, I think this is also what's been raised. Alexia mentioned it about earlier career researchers. I mean, I think we have a real problem with how to handle our young academics and coming in. Our systems aren't keeping up with where they're going. And I think similar to the point about traditional research, and I think this is where also funders have a lot to answer for, because these are these larger structures that are still controlling, determining what is considered acceptable research. And I think this is where, again, APCs, as I mentioned, in my presentation, there are a range of types of scholarship that simply aren't covered, even if the money were there. And I think that this is then also a big problem that's continuing to create extremely conventional forms of scholarship. And, frankly, our fields aren't really pushed forward in the middle. It's the boundaries. It's people pushing the boundaries that drive disciplines and fields forward. And I think those are exactly the voices that are consistently silenced. And I think this is where, for me, equity comes into play.
And before moving on, I will note that we were very conscious on this panel of being from Anglo-American perspectives. And what's absolutely great is in the rest of OASPA, you'll hear a lot of, in the rest of this conference, you'll hear a lot of voices from other parts of the world. And I think a big issue that we all recognize is equity of access for authors, especially around the world. So that's, the big issue. Sustainability. So Sam, this is where we're going to come back to you a little bit. So you drew this connection between sustainability and market-based approaches. Can you describe a little bit more about your definition of sustainability?
I guess I don't really have a particularly good definition of sustainability, but the point I'm making is that when you introduce sustainability as the dominant frame for what you're trying to do, then that sort of tends towards the market. That tends towards observable business models that kind of, as I explored, kind of enforce certain kinds of things on publishing. Now that doesn't mean that I'm asking, Berghahn Books, for instance, they obviously are trying to be a sustainable publishing operation. They are engaging in subscribe to open. That's still a kind of a market kind of practice, and that works for them. But for the Radical Open Access Collective, which I guess starts from the idea that market-centric scholarship is kind of what they want to avoid, then you can kind of approach it in a slightly different way. I mean, I think of it maybe in terms of like in the UK, we have the NHS, And the kinds of people who ask, is the NHS sustainable, are conservatives who want to defund it. If you start from the idea, like in the 60s, that monograph publishing was heavily subsidized, then this sustainability frame is just slightly different. And so we just don't want to kind of import the language of neoliberalism into what we're doing. And sustainability is kind of part of that, is what I'm saying. And it affects not-for-profit publishers, it affects kind of everything, but it's just a frame that I think is particularly unhelpful for what we're trying to do.
It can be a very effective way of shutting down a conversation, can't it? Is it going to be sustainable? Any other observations from the group about this question, sustainability, and the language used? Sharla?
Well, I'm thinking about, because boy, at LYRASIS, we talk about sustainability all the time. And so hearing that, I mean, what it makes me think, again, is meeting people where they are. There is no one model that rules them all. We're a diverse community serving a very diverse world. And I love that that Scholar-Led exists. I've gotten to talk to folks from Scholar-Led through some of my interactions with COPM. And the idea that they can set up a successful publishing instance that's not based on any commercialized, jargon, that they are meeting their authors' needs, that they can talk about care, is so important. And why it's so important, in the words that when I use, that I want to see them to be sustainable. But for other entities, and whatever maturation level that they are on this kind of spectrum that we all exist, sustainability is going to mean different things. And in my mind, it's just trying to maintain who you want to be, what you want to try to do, and who you're trying to serve. So, there are some things that I want to be more sustainable than others. Kind of share, make the large pot of money that's out there a little more equitably distributed, because it's very uneven at this point, to where those that really, I think, can make a huge impact on the world and scholarly communication as a whole, I wish had a whole lot more money in order to stay sustainable, so that they can be the leaders and guide us through this journey that we're all on. So that's my thoughts.
Alexia?
I think there is value to having a different type of conversation around planned obsolescence, because the truth of the matter is that, there is a brilliant young scholar that I've had the pleasure of working with, Katherine Splunk, who is out of Canada, and she refers to digital Tamagotchi, and how we seem to keep growing this body of material, yet we're not thinking about the ways in which perhaps some of it does need to be archived in a physical format. Perhaps some of it needs to not persist for many reasons. And so I think the sustainability piece is an important conversation for us to continue to have as an international community. But I think the underpinning of that has to be planned obsolescence. There isn't any way we can continue to grow the body of scholarship in the way in which we're growing it and have it persist, generationally across multiple platforms.
Yeah, this is also, and I'm just posting in the chat this that recent article from Science magazine. Dozens of scientific journals have vanished from the internet and no one preserved them. And some of this also connects to a question which has come up from Ali Soto. What sustainability model could work for journals that have been open access from the beginning? Some of them are struggling to get the budget to keep the journals running. It's very difficult to compete with journals that are moving from subscription model to subscription to open access. And Vivian, I'd like to start with you on this, because this is an issue for Subscribe to Open, isn't it? You have to have had a subscription base to do Subscribe to Open.
Yes, and I think in many ways, no. I mean, I think a lot of it is also, again, sort of down to the question of the relationship to the discipline and the fields that you're publishing in. I think, we come from it from the perspective of a very small publisher for whom, every subscription that we've sort of built up along the way has been real sort of in the trenches, sort of marketing and one subscription at a time. It's a very different type of publishing to the big deals that are happening sort of in boardrooms and what have you at very different elevations. So I think what we do is always extremely connected to the advocates and to the collections librarians in terms of getting their support, really one subscription at a time. And I think this is why I also feel that, you know, and we've started new journals from scratch, many of the journals that we've had. So it really is, we have started from zero. And so I don't see why native OA journals can't also take a similar approach, which is to really build and look at where you are, where are your strengths, who is your audience, and really go from there. I mean, I think, again, I think it really just has to do with one reason why maybe we are, this was sort of an easier jump for us to take, is because we're already, as I said, sort of in those trenches. And I think that we've started from zero. And that's the kind of model that we have, again, because it's very specialized, and I don't think we have grand ambitions about some of our fields because we're aware that they remain niche and specialized. So I do think there is potential there, or at least I don't think it's out of question for native OA journals to flip. But having said that, of course, you know, I think that is a big area that, for instance, Libraria are now also looking at, having worked with journals to see how they can flip, also looking at native OA journals, because I think, you know, it is thanks to many of them that we already have some of the models in place. And I think in a way that speaks to, I think, Sam's sort of comment early on about sort of our model still being rooted in a sort of a market approach. And indeed, that's where we start. And I think for a number of OA native publishers, they come from a very different perspective, perhaps in terms of business model, but I would argue that at least for us, we are just as scholar-led, having been around, you know, my mother is fully an academic with 2 PhDs and what have you. I think that we, you know, I think there is still a great service to academic publishing that is there. And I think that is then sort of that big question of how do you find models that match? But I don't think it's, you know, unattainable.
Yeah, Sharla, I think you have a comment here.
Yeah, I mean, it already exists within books and journals, with some programs being quite successful in being sustainable as OA native publishers. And what they've done, and I'm speaking of some of the OA native open book publishers, Punctum Books, but on the book side, but you also look at and Lever Press, but you also then look on the journal side. I know PLOS, and Sarah's probably going, yay, but PLOS is talking about how to kind of shift the model so that it's not so APC focused, and for some of the journals that they publish as OA native publishers. And what Berghahn Books had already in existence, and why Subscribe to Open works so well, is the community already exists. Those who already have found the value in investing in the journal, they're already there, and so you count on them continuing to see that value and continuing to invest, but with the idea that it's flipping over to open. And I think this idea is being thought about in a lot of different ways across journals and books. As far as OA natives, though, with like Open Library of Humanities and others, they have already figured out how to reduce cost internally enough as OA native publishers that they only need to cover so much of cost, and they can build communities with libraries who want to invest in them to do, and it comes out as like membership model, crowdfunding, however you want to do that, diamond or platinum kind of models where you're sponsoring, and this is where it can leap over outside of the traditional library funding into departments funding, certain centers on campus, and extending out beyond that to even funders, capital F funders contributing to these kinds of programs in order for them to innovate and continue to sustain.
And on chat, we've got a good example of how maybe it's just, the ways we're coming from an Anglo-American perspective and thinking about this. Maria Camacho is saying, in Costa Rica, many journals are just financed by public universities, so we can offer platforms in open access for the authors. So there's just an assumption that the public universities, this is one of the things they do. right?
Right. And I know we would love that in the United States. And in some ways, even university presses are kind of set up that way, depending on what kind of subsidy they have from their institution, or if they're under the library, right? It's all about where the money's coming from. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is what matters in order for it to be sustainable. And so how can you bring that money in whatever ways and build that community? And can you build that up to the higher institutional level? In the United States, it'd be a huge challenge, whereas in Europe, it's even at the national level in a lot of the funding that's done of research. So yes, exactly it. It's trying to figure out how does the money flow, and then figure out how you can build community with those that are already stakeholders.
I just want to bring up an interesting conversation here from Slack. To Sam's point about the push for sustainability plus scalability going to consolidation, homogenization, monopolization, death of innovation. I think it's probably true, but how do we fight this while still fighting for standards? Is there just a tension between the need for standards and the desire for continued innovation? Sam, would you like to address that? It's from Michelle Avisa Whiting.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's a really important question. I guess that's what we're trying to do with the COPIN project, is to, so the Radical Open Access Collective is very informal and very much kind of DIY, scholars doing whatever they can to get by. But then the COPIN project is to make scholar-led publishing slightly more formalized. And so we have a work package dedicated entirely to sort of archiving standards, one dedicated exactly to sort of governance and those kinds of things. And so then that makes scholar-led publishing more of a sort of an attractive proposition for those reasons that it is kind of more standardized. So, but I mean, I'm not entirely sure how you can push back against the big publishers with and scale in this, but I think it's a very difficult thing to do. I think what we're trying to do is sort of carve out various niches where we're allowed to do something different rather than necessarily pushing back and sort of being kind of, I don't know, counter hegemonic. That's quite a difficult thing to actually do, to sort of have impacts on the global stage. And so it's very difficult. But I think those are the things we're thinking about. How can you support through various interventions, standardization and while maintaining this kind of diversity of process and identity and scholarship. So, but yeah, it's an absolutely key question.
And I would add, if I could, that I think as publishers, I think it's also then for us, for those of us who are still offering those services, doubling down on those vital services that we provide. I think copy editing, for instance, is such a basic example of something that has increasingly been stripped away in the name of scale and speed. And I think also there is a question of qualitative, which is always kind of my stressing point, because I know that we can't compete at a level of scale, but I think what we can offer is the relational aspect as well as above all qualitative aspects. And I think this is really where publishers of a smaller size do have an advantage. And I think it is those elements that I think we always, need to be very aware of and really prioritize and slow it down. I mean, to the extent that we can. I think the pressure to publish has really created this rat race that has also then really, sort of favored scale as well as, technology and sort of certain innovations that are ultimately exploitative. And I think those are areas that I think we can and make a difference.
So there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and there are also questions in the chat. We are going to have to end the panel now, but I would like to point out that the panelists, we have committed to answering and addressing your questions over Slack. There is an excitement brewing online about the reference to the digital Tamagotchi, and a lot of retro reminiscences coming up about digital Tamagotchi. Can I just ask you, what about the digital Tamagotchi reference? What does it sort of conjure up for you? Is it the? Can you just expand on that a little bit more, Alexia? Because people loved it.
So the person, I can't take credit for the term. The person that actually I heard the term from is an amazing scholar. Her name is Katherine Splunk. She is Canadian. I think she's at Carleton University now. She was a postdoc at Duke when I first met her. And she's brilliant, and she's a digital humanist. She's creating her own library, if you will, of items, and she is on NVivo's International Advisory Board because she was able to create this whole kind of corpus of materials that she coded in NVivo, just absolutely brilliant. So I brought her in to do some analysis for us at Oberlin College Libraries around our digital humanities program, and it was a really brilliant supposition. She said, you know, you all have a lot of digital Tamagotchi, you know, and so in other words, we have all these different discrete projects that are not necessarily being ingested in our collection. They're not searchable. Many of them were created by faculty. They kept growing. We kept spending significant dollars and staff time supporting them, and they grew and grew and grew without any kind of structure or plan. And so that was her statement to us, and I loved it so much that I've been talking about it with attribution. So we have to give attribution to Katherine for that term.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to our speakers and to the delegates for listening and engaging on multiple platforms, including a special shout out to Sarah Ruhi, who appeared to be engaging on 3 different platforms at the same time, which was quite extraordinary. We'll have to look and see how many arms Sarah has next time we see her. There will now be a conference break. You'll see information about the next sessions and times on a slide coming up. In a half an hour, we'll come back for the keynote, in fact, integrating discovery and access for scholarly articles. Please do continue the conversation on the OASPA Slack channel and on Twitter at #OASPA2020. And we'd love to see your takeaways from this session on the Slack channel in English or in the language in which you're most comfortable sharing. Last but not least, thank you so much to our generous sponsors who've helped us in this unprecedented year and have made it possible to keep fees low and welcome many unfunded individuals from around the world. And I hope you leave this session recommitted to creating equity of access and opportunity, to dismantling the systems that you work within and building them up in a more equitable, diverse, socially just way. And please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much to everybody. And that's it for now.